The astral seeker spun slowly through the crimson-tinted void, its hull torn open like a broken egg. Emergency lights flickered red against the twisted metal where plasma cannons had punched through the research vessel's modest shields. Captain Veltar pressed his six-fingered hand against the communication console, his blue-scaled skin trembling as he activated the distress beacon for the third time in as many hours. "This is Captain Veltar of the Zephyrian research vessel. Astral Seeker," he spoke into the transmitter, his voice carrying the musical quality typical of his species. "We are stranded in the Crimson Nebula. Coordinates 77 Mark 49. Hull breach in sections 2 through 5. Life support failing. 12 souls aboard require immediate assistance." Behind him, his crew worked desperately to patch the gaping holes with whatever materials they could salvage. Science Officer Kefra welded metal plates with shaking hands, while communications specialist Zolmeth rerouted power from non-essential systems. The acrid smell of melted circuitry filled the recycled air. The raiders had come without warning, sleek black ships that emerged from the nebula's swirling gases like predators from tall grass. Pirates who preyed on research vessels and trading ships, unfortunate enough to venture into this forgotten corner of space. The Astral Seeker had been studying the nebula's unique quantum properties when the attack began. Now their 3-year mission lay in ruins, scattered across the cosmos along with chunks of their ship's hull. Veltar's console chimed. A response from the Galactic Council station at Proxima Relay. Hope flickered in his large, dark eyes. His crew gathered behind him as he activated the message. "Zephyrian vessel Astral Seeker, this is Galactic Council emergency response. Your request for rescue assistance has been reviewed and denied. The Crimson Nebula is classified as a Level 9 hazard zone. Council regulations prohibit rescue operations in regions with less than 15% survival probability. Your species lacks sufficient political standing to warrant exception protocols. We regret we cannot assist. End transmission." The bridge fell silent except for the hiss of escaping atmosphere through microfractures in the hull. Veltar's shoulders sagged as the weight of those words settled over his crew. Minor species, insufficient political standing. They were expendable. "Captain," whispered Engineer Nolbeth, her voice barely audible above the ship's dying systems. "What do we do now?" Before Veltar could answer, the lights went out. Emergency power kicked in moments later, bathing everything in an eerie red glow. The life support systems groaned and wheezed like a dying animal. They had maybe 48 hours of breathable air left, assuming the makeshift hull patches held. Outside, the cracked viewport, the Crimson Nebula swirled with deadly beauty. Massive gas clouds pulsed with electromagnetic energy that could fry a ship's electronics in seconds. Gravitational anomalies twisted space itself into knots that could crush a vessel like paper. And somewhere in those crimson depths, things moved, ancient creatures that fed on energy and metal, drawn to the electromagnetic signatures of damaged ships. One of them appeared now, sliding through the nebula's gases like a massive eel through water. The creature was easily 3 times the length of their ship, its translucent body glowing with bioluminescent patterns. Dozens of smaller creatures followed in its wake, their hungry forms pressing against the Astral Seeker's hull. Energy. "Feeders," breathed Science Officer Kefra, watching the creatures with fascination even in their dire situation. "They're attracted to our power core. If they breach the containment unit..." The ship shuddered as something large scraped against the outer hull. Metal groaned under pressure it was never designed to withstand. One of the creatures had latched onto their main sensor array, its feeding tentacles probing for electrical current. Days crawled by in a nightmare of failing systems and dwindling supplies. The crew took turns sleeping in shifts, huddled together, for warmth as the heating system struggled to function. Their emergency rations, protein bars that tasted like cardboard, and water recycled so many times it barely qualified as liquid, wouldn't last much longer. Veltar found himself staring out at the swirling nebula, watching the predators circle their dying ship. Other vessels had tried to traverse the Crimson Nebula over the years. Their wreckage floated in the distance, twisted metal monuments to ambition and desperation. No one had ever successfully mounted a rescue operation here. The mathematics were simple. The chances of survival were too low, the cost too high, and the potential reward too small. The Galactic Council's decision made perfect sense from their perspective. 12 Zephyrian researchers weren't worth risking a full rescue fleet. Resources had to be allocated efficiently. Ships and crews couldn't be wasted on hopeless missions. As the ship's chronometer marked their 5th day adrift, Veltar watched, his crew's hope fade like their dying emergency lights. They had done everything possible, sent distress signals on every known frequency, broadcasted their scientific data in case someone might consider it valuable enough to warrant rescue. They even transmitted personal messages to their families. But the universe remained silent. No one was coming to the Crimson Nebula. No one ever did. The cargo hold of the Iron Will hummed with the steady vibration of hyperspace engines as Captain Jimin Park scrolled through endless shipping manifests on his datapad. Medical supplies to Kepler Station, mining equipment to the Outer Rim colonies, and 300 cases of Earth coffee that somehow commanded premium prices across half the galaxy. Another routine run through the shipping lanes that kept human trade flowing between the stars. Jimin rubbed his tired eyes and reached for his coffee mug when the bridge communications array suddenly crackled to life. Communications, Officer Minji. Ko straightened in her chair, her fingers dancing across the control panel as she tried to clean up the signal, bleeding through layers of cosmic interference. "Captain, I'm picking up something on the emergency frequencies," Minji called out, her voice cutting through the bridge's routine chatter. "It's very weak, but it's definitely a distress call." Navigator Tae-hyun Lee looked up from his star charts, his dark eyes narrowing as he watched Minji work. "Where's it coming from?" Minji's face went pale as the coordinates appeared on her screen. "Sir, you're not going to believe this. The signal is originating from inside the Crimson Nebula." The bridge fell dead silent. Even the constant hum of the ship's systems seemed to quiet as the crew processed those words. The Crimson Nebula was legendary among spacers, not for treasure or discovery, but for the ships that went in and never came out. Gravitational storms that could tear a vessel apart. Radiation bursts that could cook a crew in their own hull. And things that lived in the deep dark between the stars. Things that fed on metal and energy, and didn't care whether their meal was occupied. "Let me hear it," Jimin said quietly, setting down his datapad. The distress signal filled the bridge, weak, hand crackling with static but unmistakably desperate. A melodic voice speaking in accented Standard Galactic, identifying himself as Captain Veltar of the Zephyrian research vessel, Astral Seeker. 12 souls aboard. Hull breached. Life support failing. "Sir," Tae-hyun said, his voice tight with concern as he checked his navigation displays, "we're the only ship within 3 sectors of that position. The next closest vessel is 6 days out, even at maximum burn." Chief Medical Officer Suna Kim stepped forward from her station, her medical scanner already in hand. 12 lives, Captain," she said simply, her eyes meeting Jimin's steadily. There was no pleading in her voice, no argument, just a statement of fact that somehow carried more weight than any emotional appeal. Jimin was about to respond when their communications array lit up with an incoming transmission. The Galactic Council's official seal appeared on the main screen, followed by a cold bureaucratic voice. "Attention all vessels in sectors 7 through 12. The Galactic Council Emergency Response Division has reviewed the distress call from Zephyrian vessel, Astral Seeker. Rescue operations are deemed unfeasible due to extreme hazard conditions. All ships are advised to maintain safe distances from the Crimson Nebula. Council regulations strictly prohibit unauthorized rescue attempts in Level 9 hazard zones. This transmission will not be repeated." The message cut off, leaving the bridge in stunned silence. Jimin felt his jaw clench as the implications sank in. 12 people were dying out there, and the Council had just written them off as acceptable losses. Too dangerous, too expensive, too inconvenient. The communications array crackled again as other ships in the area began responding to the situation. A Centauri merchant vessel was the first to speak up, its captain's voice dripping with disdain. "Well, that settles it then. Shame about the Zephyrians, but that's what happens when you go poking around forbidden space. Natural selection at work. An Altarian transport ship chimed in next. Agreed. The Council knows what it's doing. Those nebula storms have claimed hundreds of ships over the years. No point adding to the body count. Then came the voice that made Jimin's blood boil. A Centauri captain he'd dealt with before. A arrogant merchant named Vexler, who thought his species' advanced technology made them superior to everyone else. Humans, Vexler's voice carried across the comm channels with obvious amusement. I know you people have a reputation for recklessness, but surely even you aren't stupid enough to attempt a rescue in the Crimson Nebula. Your primitive ships would be torn apart before you made it halfway through the outer storms. Other alien captains began joining the conversation, their voices filled with a mixture of mockery and genuine bewilderment at the idea that anyone would risk their lives for strangers. To them, it was simple mathematics. 12 unknown Zephyrians weren't worth risking 30 human lives and a perfectly good cargo ship. Jimin looked around his bridge at his crew. Engineer Hyun-woo Choi had emerged from the engine room, drawn by the commotion. Security Chief Min-ho Song stood near the tactical station, his arms crossed but his expression thoughtful. Pilot Yuna Park had abandoned her routine system checks to listen to the debate raging across the comm channels. They were all looking at him, waiting for his decision. These weren't military officers bound by duty or regulations. They were merchant spacers who had signed up to haul cargo between the stars for decent pay and steady work. They had families waiting for them at various ports of call. They had every right to prioritize their own safety over the lives of strangers. But as Jimin looked into their faces, he saw something that the alien captains on the comm channels couldn't understand. He saw the same expression he'd worn when he'd first heard that distress call. Not calculation or cost-benefit analysis, but simple human conviction that some things mattered more than profit margins and survival percentages. Minji, he said, quietly, open a channel to all frequencies. His communications officer nodded and activated the transmitter. You're live, Captain. Jimin's voice carried across 3 sectors of space, reaching every ship within range. This is Captain Jimin. Park of the human vessel Iron Will. To the Centauri captain who thinks we're too primitive to attempt this rescue, you're probably right. Our ships aren't as advanced as yours. Our technology isn't as sophisticated, but we have something you apparently don't. He paused, looking out at the swirling crimson clouds visible through the bridge viewport. We don't abandon people, ever. Taehyun, plot a course into the nebula. All hands, prepare for emergency operations. We're going to bring those people home. The first gravitational wave hit the Iron Will like an invisible fist, sending Captain Jimin Park crashing into his command chair as the entire ship twisted sideways through space. Emergency klaxons wailed throughout the vessel as they crossed into the Crimson Nebula's outer boundary, where the laws of physics seemed to bend and break like twisted metal. All hands, brace for impact, Jimin shouted over the ship's intercom, as another wave of distorted gravity slammed into their hull. The cargo hold groaned under the stress, and somewhere deep in the ship's belly, he could hear containers breaking loose from their magnetic clamps. In the engine room, Chief Engineer Hyun-woo Choi was fighting a losing battle against forces that wanted to tear his ship apart at the molecular level. Sweat poured down his face as he rerouted power through backup systems, his hands flying over control panels that sparked and died under the nebula's electromagnetic interference. Captain! Hyun-woo's voice crackled through the comm system. The quantum drive is overheating. These gravitational fields are playing hell with our space-time displacement matrix. Can you keep us moving? Jimin called back, gripping his chair as the ship bucked like an angry horse. I'm trying, but it's like trying to swim upstream in a waterfall made of pure chaos. The bridge viewport showed a nightmare landscape of swirling crimson gases that pulsed with their own internal light. Massive electromagnetic storms crackled between gas clouds, sending brilliant arcs of energy that could vaporize a ship in seconds. In the distance, Jimin could see the twisted wreckage of other vessels that had dared to enter this cosmic graveyard, their metal bones picked clean by creatures that fed on technology itself. Hull integrity at 60%, shouted Tactical Officer Yuna Park, her voice barely audible over the groaning metal that surrounded them. Warning lights flashed red across her console as micro-fractures spread through the ship's outer hull, like spider webs. "Sir, we're taking structural damage faster than our repair systems can compensate." Navigator Tae-hyun Lee cursed in Korean as his instruments exploded in a shower of sparks. The navigation computer, which had guided them safely through hyperspace for 3 years, died with the electronic scream. "Navigation systems failing. The electromagnetic interference is scrambling everything. I'm flying blind in here." But Tae-hyun didn't stop. Even without his instruments, he kept his hands on the manual controls, steering by instinct and the faint visual references he could pick out through the swirling chaos. His grandfather had been a pilot in the old days, back when humans first reached for the stars with nothing but chemical rockets and stubborn determination. "Fly by the seat of your pants," the old man had always said. "When technology fails, trust your gut." Medical Officer Suna Kim braced herself against the medical bay's bulkhead as another gravitational anomaly sent medical supplies flying across the room. She was already preparing for casualties, knowing that even if they found the Zephyrian ship, getting everyone back safely would be a miracle. But miracles were something humans specialized in, especially when lives were on the line. Security Chief Min-ho Song made his way through the ship's corridors, checking on crew members and making sure the emergency systems were functioning. The artificial gravity flickered on and off, sending him floating toward the ceiling one moment and crashing to the floor the next. But he kept moving, kept checking, kept making sure his people were ready for whatever came next. Miles away, drifting helplessly in the nebula's heart, the Zephyrian research vessel, Astral Seeker, detected something impossible on their failing sensors. Captain Veltar's large dark eyes widened as he stared at the readings that couldn't possibly be real. "Science Officer Zefka," he called weakly, his voice hoarse from days of recycled air. "Are our sensors malfunctioning?" Zefka looked up from the jury-rigged control panel she'd been nursing for the past day. Her blue-scaled hands trembled as she confirmed the readings. "No, Captain. There's definitely a ship out there, a single vessel moving through the outer storm wall." The entire Zephyrian crew gathered around the sensor display, watching in stunned silence as a ship barely half their size fought its way through conditions that had destroyed vessels twice as large. The electromagnetic storms that surrounded them should have fried any ship's electronics within minutes. The gravitational anomalies should have crushed any hull not specifically designed for such extremes. "It's impossible," whispered Engineer Nolbeth. "No ship can survive those conditions. We've been monitoring this region for 3 years, and we've never seen anything like this." But the sensor readings didn't lie. Kilometer by kilometer, the unknown vessel was punching through the nebula's defenses, taking damage that would have crippled most ships, but somehow still moving forward, still coming toward them. "Captain," Zefka said quietly, "I'm reading the ship's identification beacon. It's human." The bridge fell silent, except for the hiss of their failing life support systems. Humans, the species that most of the galaxy still considered newcomers to the cosmic community. Barely a century into space travel, with technology that older races often dismissed as crude and primitive. "Why would they risk this?" Zefka whispered, watching the human ship fight through another wave of gravitational distortion. "We're strangers to them. Our species have barely even had diplomatic contact. Why would they endanger themselves for people they've never met?" Captain Veltar stared at the display, remembering the Galactic Council's cold rejection of their plea for help. 12 Zephyrian lives weren't worth the risk, they'd said. The mathematics didn't add up. The cost was too high for the potential reward. But somehow these humans had done the math differently. They'd looked at 12 lives hanging in the balance and decided that the equation was simple. People needed help, and help was coming. "Because," Veltar said softly, his voice filled with something he hadn't felt in days, "they're human. And apparently that means something very different from what we thought." On the human ship, alarms continued to wail as the iron will pushed deeper into the nebula's embrace, chasing a faint distress signal through conditions that should have been instantly fatal. But they kept going, held together by engineering, skill, stubborn determination, and something that couldn't be measured on any sensor array, the unshakable human conviction that no one gets left behind. The Iron Will drifted slowly toward the crippled Zephyrian vessel, both ships looking like wounded animals limping through the crimson storm. Captain Jimin Park gripped the bridge railing as another gravitational wave rolled past them, sending both vessels spinning in a deadly dance through the nebula's chaotic embrace. "Docking clamps are damaged, Captain," reported Engineer Hyunwoo. "Joy over the comm system. I can't guarantee a solid connection between the ships. One wrong move and we'll tear both hulls apart." "Then we don't make any wrong moves," Jimin replied, pulling on his emergency suit. The helmet's heads-up display flickered with radiation warnings as the nebula's energy storms washed over them. "Minho, Yoonji, suit up. We're going over there the hard way." Security Chief Minho Song checked his magnetic boots and safety tethers, while Medical Officer Yoonji Nam loaded her kit with supplies for 12 different alien physiologies. None of them had ever treated Zephyrians before, but that wasn't going to stop them from trying. The airlock cycled open with a hiss of escaping atmosphere, revealing the nightmare landscape outside. The space between the two ships crackled with electromagnetic energy that danced across their suit shields like living lightning. Massive creatures moved through the distant gas clouds, energy feeders drawn by the ship's power signatures, their translucent forms pulsing with bioluminescent hunger. "Stay close," Jimin said into his comm as they kicked off from the Iron Will's hull. "If we get separated in this soup, we might never find each other again." The journey across 30 meters of space felt like crossing an ocean during a hurricane. Gravitational eddies grabbed at their bodies, trying to spin them away into the nebula's depths. Electromagnetic pulses threatened to overload their suit systems. And all around them, the cosmic storm raged with forces that could crush planets. They slammed into the Zephyrian ship's hull with bone-jarring impact, magnetic boots clamping onto the twisted metal, just as another energy wave rolled through the area. Minho found the emergency airlock and began the manual override procedure, while Jimin and Yoonji prepared for whatever they might find inside. The Zephyrian ship's interior was a disaster zone. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows through corridors, filled with floating debris. The air tasted of ozone and fear, recycled through failing life support systems that wheezed with each breath. And huddled together in what remained of their bridge were 12 alien beings who looked like they'd given up hope of ever seeing home again. Captain Veltar was the first to spot the humans entering their ship. His six-fingered hands trembled as he reached for a broken communicator, trying to translate their words through damaged universal language processors. The other Zephyrians pressed back against the bulkheads, their large dark eyes wide with terror at these strange beings who had somehow appeared from the storm. "Easy there," Jimin said gently, removing his helmet to show his human face. He raised his hands in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. "We are here to get you home." The relief that washed over the Zephyrian crew was almost tangible. Science Officer Zefka began crying, tears of gratitude streaming down her blue-scaled cheeks as she realized that rescue had actually come. That someone had cared enough to risk everything for strangers. "Your ship," Captain Veltar managed in broken Standard Galactic. "It should not survive here. How did you—" "We can discuss engineering techniques later," Jimin interrupted with a smile. "Right now, we need to get you all transferred to our vessel before—" The massive gravitational wave hit without warning, slamming both ships together like toys in the hands of an angry giant. The Zephyrian vessel's already damaged structure groaned and buckled under the stress. Bulkheads collapsed in showers of sparks and twisted metal. Researcher Kolnith screamed as a section of ceiling came down on top of him, pinning his leg under a beam that must have weighed half a ton. Green blood, Zephyrian ichor, began pooling around the twisted metal as bone-deep lacerations opened along his trapped limb. "Help him!" Zefka cried, but the other Zephyrians were too weak and injured to lift the massive debris. Without a moment's hesitation, Minho Song threw himself at the fallen beam while Hyunwoo, who had just arrived with the second rescue team, grabbed the other end. The two humans strained against metal that should have required heavy lifting equipment, their faces red with effort as they fought to free the trapped alien. "Almost got it," Minho grunted, his boots sliding on the deck plating as he put every ounce of strength into the lift. "Come on, you stubborn piece of—" The beam shifted just enough for Yunji to slide underneath with her medical kit. She worked quickly, her hands steady despite the ship shaking around them as she applied emergency trauma patches and injected Kolneth with universal painkillers that worked on most known physiologies. Compound fracture of the primary leg bone, she reported while working. Severe lacerations but no arterial damage. He'll live if we can get him to proper medical facilities. The other Zephyrians watched in stunned amazement as these humans, beings they'd never met from a species they barely knew, risked their own lives to save one injured researcher. There was no hesitation, no calculation of cost versus benefit, just immediate action to preserve life. Why? Captain Veltar asked Jimin as they prepared to move Kolneth to the human ship. Why endanger yourselves for one of us? Your people don't even know us. We have nothing to offer in return. Jimin looked up from helping Yunji stabilize the injured. Zephyrian, his expression matter-of-fact. No one gets left behind, he said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the universe. That's what humans do. Another gravitational wave was building in the distance, visible as a distortion in the nebula's crimson gases. They had maybe minutes before it hit with enough force to finish what the raiders had started. Time to go, Jimin announced, lifting. Kolneth in his arms despite the alien being nearly his own size. Everyone stays together. We're all going home today. As they began the dangerous transfer back to the Iron Will, the Zephyrians realized they were witnessing something that would change how they viewed humanity forever. Not as primitive newcomers to the galactic community, but as beings who had somehow managed to preserve something that older, more civilized races had apparently lost along the way. The simple conviction that every life has value, regardless of species, politics, or probability of success. The Iron Will's engines screamed in protest as Captain Jimin Park pushed them beyond their design limits, racing to escape the Crimson Nebula's deadly embrace. Behind them, the cosmic storm raged with renewed fury, as if angry that its prey was slipping away. The ship's hull groaned under stress fractures that spider-webbed across the outer plating, while inside, 24 souls held their breath and prayed to whatever gods they believed in. "Come on, girl," Engineer Hyunwoo Choi whispered to his beloved engines, his hands dancing over control panels that sparked and flickered with each passing second. "Just a little further. Don't quit. On me now." The quantum drive's containment field fluctuated dangerously as they approached the nebula's outer boundary. Warning lights bathed the engine room in hellish red as temperatures climbed into the danger zone. But Hyunwoo kept pushing, kept coaxing every last erg of power from systems that should have failed hours ago. On the bridge, Navigator Taehyun, Lee watched his instruments die one by one as the nebula's electromagnetic interference finally overwhelmed their shielding. But he could see it ahead of them, the blessed darkness of normal space, where the laws of physics worked the way they were supposed to and ships didn't get torn apart by invisible forces. 30 seconds to boundary, he called out, his voice tight with concentration. Hull integrity at 23% and falling. "Sir, I don't think we're going to make it." "We'll make it," Jimin replied with quiet confidence, though sweat beaded on his forehead as he watched the structural readings plummet toward critical failure. In the medical bay, the 12 Zephyrian survivors huddled together, their large eyes wide with a mixture of hope and terror as their rescuers fought to save them all. The ship lurched violently as they crossed the boundary, and suddenly the universe became quiet. The constant battering of gravitational waves ceased. The electromagnetic storms faded to nothing, and in that moment of blessed silence, every system on the Iron Will finally gave up the ghost. "Engines offline," Hyunwoo reported, his voice filled with exhaustion and relief. "Everything's offline, but we're out. We made it." The bridge erupted in cheers as the crew realized they were alive and in normal space. But in the medical bay, the Zephyrians sat in stunned silence, processing what they had just witnessed. Captain Veltar stared out through the viewport at the stars that no longer swirled with cosmic fury, his six-fingered hands trembling with emotions he couldn't name. "They came for us," he whispered to Science Officer Zefka, his voice barely audible above the ship's dying systems. "Through hell itself, they came." Researcher Kolneth, his leg wrapped in human medical bandages, looked up from his treatment couch. The Galactic Council said it was impossible. Every other species said it was suicide, but they came anyway. Why? Asked Engineer Nolbeth, the question that had been haunting all of their minds. We're nothing to them. Strangers from a minor species they barely know exists. What did they gain by risking everything for us? The answer came from Medical Officer Suna Kim, who was checking on their conditions with instruments that had been jury-rigged to work with Zephyrian physiology. Nothing, she said simply. We gained nothing except the knowledge that you're alive and going home to your families. Sometimes that's enough. Within hours of their emergence from the nebula, the story began to spread. The human ship's emergency, transponder broadcast their successful rescue across all frequencies, and suddenly, every communications array in 3 sectors was buzzing with the impossible news. The species that the Galactic Council had dismissed as crude newcomers had accomplished what established civilizations wouldn't even attempt. On the Centauri trading vessel, Golden Prophet, Captain Vexler stared at his communications display in disbelief. Impossible, he muttered. Humans don't have the technology for a nebula rescue. Their ships are primitive compared to ours. But the evidence was undeniable. Long-range sensors confirmed that both the human cargo ship and the Zephyrian research vessel had emerged from the Crimson Nebula, battered and barely functional, but alive. The story spread through galactic communication networks like wildfire. On thousands of worlds, beings from hundreds of different species heard about the humans who had flown into certain death to save 12 strangers. News networks across the galaxy led with the story. Diplomatic channels buzzed with activity as governments tried to understand what this meant for interspecies relations. On Earth, when the news finally reached humanity's homeworld, the reaction was puzzled confusion. President Lee Minji held a press conference where she was asked why humans would risk so much for aliens they'd never met. Because they needed help, she replied, looking genuinely confused by the question. Isn't that reason enough? But it was the response from other rescued crews that truly began to change things. Within days, similar stories emerged from across the galaxy. Human traders who had diverted from profitable routes to answer distress calls, human explorers who had shared their supplies with stranded alien vessels, human colonists who had opened their settlements to refugees from species they'd never encountered before. The pattern was unmistakable, and it sent shockwaves through the established galactic order. These newcomers, these primitives who had barely learned to travel between the stars, were operating by a completely different set of rules. They didn't calculate cost versus benefit when lives were at stake. They didn't consider political implications. Before offering aid, they just helped, simply because help was needed. 3 weeks after the rescue, an official delegation from the Galactic Council arrived at Earth's orbital stations. Ambassador Kethvar of the Altarian Republic delivered a formal invitation for humanity to join the Council as a full member species, an honor that typically took centuries of careful diplomacy to achieve. Your species has demonstrated qualities that we had not anticipated, the ambassador said during the ceremony. You have shown us that advancement is not merely measured in technology or political sophistication, but in the willingness to act on principle even when the cost is high. But for Captain Jimin Park and the crew of the Iron Will, the real victory was much simpler. They stood on the observation deck of Zephyria Prime's orbital station, watching as the 12 researchers they had saved were reunited with families who had given them up for dead. The tears of joy were universal, transcending species barriers and linguistic differences. Captain Veltar approached Jimin as the celebration continued around them. My people are planning a memorial, he said, a monument to commemorate what you did for us. Jimin shook his head with a slight smile. That's not necessary. We just did what anyone would do. No, Veltar replied firmly. That's what we've learned. Anyone would not do what you did, but humans would, and that makes all the difference. The memorial was built anyway, a simple stone monument in the center of Zephyria Prime's capital city. The inscription was written in dozens of languages, but the message was the same in all of them. They came when no one else would. This is what humans do. And across the galaxy, other species began to take notice, not of humanity's weapons or technology or economic power, but of something far more dangerous to the established order, the radical idea that every life has value, regardless of politics, profit, or probability of success. It was a concept that would reshape galactic civilization in ways that no one could yet imagine. The end